Chapter 1. The Ashes of Miranda. The morning had been so still. Bannon remembered that detail later when the smoke had cleared. He remembered the way the light had fallen through his kitchen window in long, pale ribbons, and the smell of dried sage hanging near the hearth. He'd been grinding herbs, foxglove and willow bark, into a fine paste for old Maren's joints. He remembered thinking that the day would be unremarkable. Then the trembling began. It came up through the floor first, a faint vibration that set the glass bottles on his shelf dancing. He'd paused, pestle still in hand, and listened. Outside, in the lane below, a dog began to bark. Sharp, frightened sounds, and then came the low, metallic groan of something vast and mechanical moving beyond the city wall. He'd heard Magitech armor before, at a distance, on the trade roads. The Empire's iron beasts, crawling across the continent like slow insects. But never this close, never this many. By the time he reached the street, Arvis was already there, standing at the corner with his coat half buttoned and his face the color of old parchment. They'd been friends for years. Arvis, the tinkerer, Bannon, the healer. Two men who'd built their lives on being helpful and hopeful. But there was nothing hopeful about the expression on Arvis's face. It was the look of a man watching something he'd feared become suddenly, terribly real. "They're coming through the eastern gate," he warned. What followed was not a battle. Miranda had no army, no garrison worth the name. What followed was a procession of fire and iron through streets that had known nothing worse than a drunken scuffle on market day. The Magitech armor came first. Hulking, graceless machines that crushed the cobblestones beneath their treads and spat beams of searing light into storefronts and doorways. Imperial soldiers marched behind them in ordered columns, their boots striking the ground in unison, a sound like a single, enormous heartbeat. Bannon and Arvis moved against the tide of fleeing citizens, not out of bravery, but out of instinct. Bannon was a healer after all. When he saw a woman fallen in the street with burns across her arm, he didn't think. He knelt. He pressed his palms to the wound and felt the warmth of curative magic pass through him, that familiar, aching pull from somewhere behind his ribs, and watched the skin begin to mend. Arvis pulled the woman to her feet and pointed her toward the western road, away from the fire. They did this again and again. A child with a gash along her temple, an old man whose leg had buckled beneath him, a boy clutching a dog to his chest, both trembling. Bannon healed what he could, and Arvis guided them onward, and slowly, without meaning to, they became the center of a current, a stream of wounded and frightened people flowing toward them, and then away, westward, toward the tree line, and whatever safety the hills might offer. It was in the midst of this that Bannon saw her, the green-haired girl. She moved through the burning street like a sleepwalker, her steps measured and even, utterly untouched by the chaos around her. Her hair was the color of sea foam, long and strange, and it caught the light of the fires in a way that made it seem almost but it was her face that stopped him. It was empty, his feeling held in check. This was absence, a void where a person should have been. On her head, she wore a crown, thin, metallic, encircling her brow like a band of dark iron. And set into its center was a crystal that pulsed with a faint, sick light, a rhythm like breathing, like something alive. She raised her hands. What came from her was not fire, though it burned. It was not wind, though it tore the walls apart. It was something older and more terrible, a force that bent the air itself into a shrieking, visible wave, and where it touched, the world simply came undone. Stone dissolved into powder, timber burst into flame. A fountain in the square, old marble carved with leaping fish, shattered into a cloud of dust and steam. 3 houses on the northern side of the street folded inward, their beams snapping with sounds like bones breaking. And where they had stood, there was only a shallow, smoking crater. The acrid smell of smoke became unbearable. Bannon couldn't move. Beside him, Arvis whispered something, a prayer or a curse, and gripped his arm. The crown, Arvis breathed. Look at the crown, that light. Bannon looked. The crystal pulsed again, and the girl's hands rose. Another wave of destruction rolled outward with the same dreamlike calm. She wasn't choosing this. He understood that with a certainty that settled into his intense gaze. Whatever that crown was, it had hollowed her out and filled the space with something else, something directed, something commanded. She was a weapon, or rather, a young woman turned into a weapon. He pulled his gaze away because he had to, because there were people behind him who needed him. And it was then, as Bannon guided another group of citizens to safety, when he saw the lead officer. She stood on a low ridge near the eastern gate, slightly apart from the advancing column, and even at a distance, Bannon could see the pale gold of her hair against the dark imperial armor. She was young for someone in command, and she stood with her arms folded and her chin raised, watching the destruction with an expression that Bannon couldn't quite read. A soldier approached her, saluting before speaking. He was too far away to hear most of it, but the wind carried a fragment. 2 words, clipped and deferential. General Celes, he'd called her. The woman's voice was low, and though Bannon couldn't make out the words, he could hear the cadence of command, the order to continue the attack, to press forward. The soldier saluted again and turned back toward the column. But the general didn't move. She stood there a moment longer, watching the smoke rise, and in the orange light of the burning city, Bannon saw something shift across her face. It was brief, barely a flicker, and perhaps he was wrong. Perhaps it was only the play of firelight, but it looked like regret. He didn't have time to wonder about it. Arvis was pulling at his arm, and behind them, the crowd of survivors had grown to nearly 40. They were all looking to him, with wide and trusting eyes, as though he was something more than an old man with herb-stained hands and a gift for mending cuts. He turned away from the general and from the green-haired girl and from the city that had been his home. He led them into the forest towards the hills that lay beyond. The smoke followed her, not literally. The wind carried it eastward, away from where Seller's chair stood. But she could feel it in her hair, on her skin, in the folds of her cloak. She'd learned, over the course of several campaigns, that the smell of a burning city was not one thing, but many. Charred wood and heated stone, and the sharp tang of scorched grain from a storehouse. And beneath it all, faintly, the smell of flesh. It was this last scent that lingered. It always did. She hadn't given the order to burn the granary. That had been an initiative from a lieutenant in the 3rd column, a man eager for commendation, no doubt. But it didn't matter. She'd given the order that had set the 3rd column in motion, and so the destruction that followed was on her. This was what command meant. You owned everything that happened beneath you, whether you'd chosen it or not. The soldier returned with his report. Resistance had been negligible. The city was secured. Casualties among Imperial forces were minimal. He listed numbers with the flat precision of a man reading inventory. Sellers listened and nodded, giving the appropriate responses. But her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about the girl. Terror. That was the name Kefka used when he bothered to use a name at all. More often, he called her the weapon, or the puppet, or simply gestured in her direction with a lazy flick of his fingers, the way one might indicate a piece of furniture that needed moving. Gestal was more careful with his language. He said asset, he said investment, but the meaning was the same. She wasn't a person to them. She was a function. Celes had watched her during the assault. She'd had no choice. The girl's power was impossible to ignore. It radiated from her in waves that distorted the air, and where it struck, it left nothing standing. The precision was remarkable and empty. Terror didn't aim. She didn't choose targets. The crown chose for her, or rather, whoever held the crown's tether chose for her. And today, that tether had been in Kefka's painted hands, and he'd used it with the idle cruelty of a boy pulling wings from a moth. The girl's face had been serene throughout, not peaceful, vacant. The same expression she wore when she was led to her quarters in the evening and seated in her chair to stare at the wall until someone came to use her again. The crown's crystal had pulsed with that faint, rhythmic light, and each pulse had drawn another wave of destruction from her outstretched hands. Sellers had felt something. She didn't have a word for it yet. It sat below her ribs like a swallowed coal, and each time she breathed, she was aware of its warmth. She turned from the ridge and walked down toward the occupied city's center, her boots crunching on debris. Soldiers saluted as she passed, and she returned each salute with a precise mechanical nod. She was good at this. She'd been raised for it, shaped from childhood by the Empire's design. Sid had given her magic when she was young, the ice that lived in her veins, the cold force she could summon with a thought. These were as natural to her as breathing, and just as involuntary. She was, in her own way, as much a product of the Empire's ambition as the green-haired girl. The difference was the crown. Celes could choose. Terra could not. She paused at the edge of what had been the town square. The marble fountain, something old and lovely, carved in a style she didn't recognize, was gone. In its place was a shallow bowl of scorched earth, still faintly steaming. Nearby, a child's shoe lay on its side in the dust, small and worn at the heel. Celes looked at it for a long moment. She'd noticed the survivors. In the confusion of the assault, a sizable group had slipped westward toward the forest, guided by someone, an old man. She'd seen him from the ridge, grey-haired, unhurried, moving among the wounded with a steadiness that struck her as remarkable amid so much panic. He'd knelt beside the fallen and pressed his hands to their injuries, and she'd seen the telltale shimmer of curative magic. Faint. Nothing like the raw power that flowed through her own veins, or the devastating force the crown pulled from Terra, but real. A healer. The survivors had gathered around him like water finding a channel, and he'd led them out through the western lanes while the third column was still busy with the granary. She could have stopped them. A word to the pursuing units, a redirected Magitech squadron, and the western road would have been sealed. The order had been on her lips. She'd felt it forming, the shape of the words, the breath behind them, and then she'd let it pass. She'd told herself it was a matter of efficiency. The city was the objective, not a column of refugees. There was no strategic value in pursuit. She told herself that, and she almost believed it. The wind shifted, carrying the smoke away at last, and Celes stood alone amidst the ashes of her victory. With a sigh, she turned and walked back toward the command post, her stride even, her face composed. And if there was something behind her eyes that shouldn't have been there, some flicker of sadness, a shadow of doubt, she just hoped that no one was close enough to see it. Chapter 2. The Healer and the General. The hills west of Miranda were not kind. The soil was thin and rocky, the trees bent by wind, and the streams ran low, even in the summer. But they offered something Miranda no longer could: distance from the Empire. Bannon had led the survivors to an old mining settlement in the foothills, a place called Braden's Hollow, that had been abandoned years ago when the veins ran dry. The buildings were rough but sound, timber and stone, built by people who understood weather. And with some work, they'd become livable again. Roofs were patched, hearths were cleared. A well was found to still hold clean water, which Bannon considered a small miracle and treated as such, offering a quiet word of thanks as the first bucket came up clear. Weeks passed. The survivors settled into the careful rhythms of people rebuilding from nothing. They shared what they had. They didn't speak much about Miranda, though sometimes at night Bannon could hear weeping. They came to him. That was the thing he couldn't escape. Not just for healing, though there was plenty of that, but for everything else as well. Where should the supply cache be kept? Should they send scouts back toward Miranda? Was it safe to light fires after dark? They asked him these things as though he possessed some wisdom beyond the ordinary, some insight that his years and his healer's hands conferred. He answered their questions as best he could and tried not to let them see his uncertainty. Arvis, to his credit, didn't pretend otherwise. "You're guessing, aren't you?" he asked one evening, sitting across from Bannon at the rough table in what had become, by default, the community's meeting hall. "I'm doing my best." "Yes, and your best happens to be quite good, which is the problem," Arvis said. He had a way of smiling that made even unwelcome observations feel like warmth. "They trust you, Bannon, not because you have answers, but because you stayed. You didn't run. You knelt in the street and healed their wounds while the city burned around you, and then you walked them out. That's not something people forget." Bannon looked at his hands. The herb stains had faded, replaced by the ordinary grime of hard living. "I'm a healer, Arvis. That's all I've ever been." "And what do you think they need most right now? Someone who can hurt, or someone who can heal?" The candle between them flickered. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a low, steady sound. "It's not just us," Arvis continued. "I've been making contact with people in other towns. Moblis, Zen, even as far as Nash. There are others who feel as we do. Others who've lost what we've lost, or who see it coming and want to act before it arrives. They're scattered, disorganized, afraid, but they're there." "And what would you have me do with them?" Arvis was quiet for a moment. He turned the candle with his fingers, watching the flame lean and recover. "Miranda was a good place," he said. "I'd like to return it to what it was. I'd like to return all of it, the whole world, to what it was before Gestal decided it belonged to him." He paused, and something settled in his expression, a clarity that Bannon recognized as the look Arvis wore when an idea had found its final shape. "That's what we'd be, really. Returners. People trying to bring something back." The word hung in the air between them, simple and unadorned. "The returners," Bannon repeated slowly. "It's not a grand name, but it's an honest one." Bannon closed his eyes. He thought of the girl in the crown and the terrible light that had poured from her hands. He thought of the blonde general on the ridge, the flicker of something human in her face. He thought of the people sleeping in the cabins around them, trusting him to know what came next. "I'm not a leader, Arvis." "No," Arvis agreed gently. "But you could become one. And I think, perhaps, you'll have to." The candle burned low. The wind pressed against the walls. Bannon sat, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. And Arvis, who knew him well enough to read the silence, simply nodded and let the quiet settle around them like a blanket. The girl's cell was in the lower levels of the Magitech research facility, in a corridor that smelled of damp stone and rust. It wasn't truly a cell. There were no bars, no locks. There was a closed door, yes, but it wasn't bolted. There was no need. The crown did more work than any chain or lock ever forged. Celes stood outside the door, still hesitating to enter. She told herself she was conducting an inspection. It was within her authority. She was a general, one of the youngest in the Empire's history, and the Magitech research facility fell under military jurisdiction. If anyone asked, she was checking on a strategic asset, assessing readiness, the kind of thing a diligent officer would do. She sighed, then opened the door. Terra sat in a wooden chair near the far wall. The room was small and bare. A cot, a basin of water, a single lamp that cast a thin yellow light. The girl's hands rested in her lap, palms down, fingers slightly curled. Her green hair fell past her shoulders, lank and unwashed. The crown encircled her brow, its crystal dark now, pulsing with only the faintest rhythm. A slow heartbeat, barely visible. Her eyes were open, but vacant. Celes stepped inside cautiously. "Terra," she whispered. The name felt strange in her mouth. She'd heard Kefka use it, and Gestal, but always in passing, always as a label attached to a function. She'd never spoken it directly to the girl before. She wasn't sure anyone had. There was no response. The green eyes didn't move. The hands didn't shift. The faint pulse of the crown continued its slow, indifferent rhythm. Celes took another step closer. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. No response. Celes looked closer, inspecting the fine grain of the crown's metal, the way it pressed against Terra's forehead and left faint indentations there, like the marks a ring leaves after years of wearing. The crystal was small, no larger than a thumbnail, but up close she could see that it wasn't a single stone. It was layered, faceted, with something moving inside it. A light that turned and folded in on itself like something alive. "I know you're in there," Celes said softly, kneeling in front of her. "Somewhere." She raised her hand. Her fingers hovered near the crown, close enough to feel the faint hum of its energy, a vibration that set her on edge. It resonated with the magic in her own blood, in a way that felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. The metal was thin, a simple band. It would take so little effort to lift it away. She wondered what would happen, whether the girl's eyes would clear, whether some spark of self would rise to the surface, whether she would speak, whether she would scream. Her fingers trembled. She reached closer. "Oh, I wouldn't do that." The voice came from the doorway, light and musical, and utterly without warmth. Celes's hand froze. She didn't turn, not immediately. She held still for the span of a single breath, composing her face, and only then did she rise and look toward the door. Kefka Palazzo leaned against the frame with his arms crossed and his head tilted at an angle that might have been playful on anyone else. His painted face was arranged in an expression of mild, delighted interest, the way a cat might look at a mouse that had just done something unexpected. His robes, garish, layered, a riot of color that seemed designed to assault the eye, shifted as he straightened and took a step into the room. "Removing the crown," he continued, his tone both patronizing and threatening. "That would be tampering with imperial property, and tampering with imperial property is..." He tapped a finger against his chin. "What's the word?" "Treason." He smiled, his thin lips spreading to the red pigment around his eyes. "You know what the Empire does to traitors, don't you?" "I was inspecting the asset," Celes calmly countered, "as is my right." "Inspecting," Kefka repeated, savoring the word. "Is that what you were doing with your fingers so close to the crown? Inspecting?" He took another step. He was close enough now that she could smell the cloying sweetness of whatever perfume he wore. Something thick and floral that didn't quite mask the sharper scent beneath it. "Because it looked to me like you were reaching, and reaching toward the crown suggests, well, it suggests all sorts of interesting things, doesn't it?" Celes met his gaze. The painted eyes stared back, shallow and bright. She could feel the cold gathering at her fingertips, the ice in her blood responding to the tension. She held it in check with an effort that she hoped didn't show on her face. "Kefka?" The new voice came from the corridor, calm and measured, and carrying the quiet authority of someone who had long ago learned that shouting was unnecessary. Sid Marquez appeared in the doorway, his white coat slightly rumpled, his spectacles pushed up onto his forehead. He looked at the scene before him, his expression calm. But something in his posture shifted, a subtle squaring of the shoulders. "I believe you're due in the upper laboratory," Sid said. "The Emperor requested a field demonstration of the girl's current thresholds, something about testing her output against armored targets." He paused. "Live targets, I believe he said." Kefka's attention swung towards Sid, like a weather vane catching a new wind. The painted smile widened. "Oh, did he now?" Kefka squealed. The delight in his voice was genuine this time. A child promised a new toy. He glanced back at Celes, and for a moment, something flickered behind the painted mask, something cold and measured. Then it was gone, replaced by theatrical indifference. "Well then, let's not keep them waiting," he said. Kefka crossed to Terra's chair and gripped her arm. Terra stood, swaying slightly, her empty eyes staring through him. "And do be careful with your inspections, General," Kefka added lightly. "Curiosity is such a dangerous thing." With that, he led Terra out. Their footsteps receded down the corridor, and then there was silence. Celes exhaled, not realizing she'd been holding her breath. Sid stepped fully into the room and closed the door. "You can't do that," he said quietly. "I know. If he reports what he saw, he won't. Not yet," she assured. "He enjoys the suspicion more than the accusation. He'll hold it, use it, play with it. That's how he is." Sid removed his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked old in the lamplight, older than his years. "Celes," he said, and the way he said her name was not the way a scientist addresses a general. It was the way a father speaks to a child, who has wandered toward a cliff's edge. "What were you doing?" She looked at the empty chair. I wanted to see if she could speak without the crown. I wanted to know if there was still someone in there. "There is," Sid confirmed. "I'm certain of it. The crown suppresses will, not identity. If it were removed, she would, in theory, recover. In time. Then why? Because the moment that crown is removed without authorization, the person who removes it will be executed, and the crown will be placed back on her head within the hour, and nothing will have changed except that someone will be dead." His voice was gentle but insistent. "You cannot help her by throwing yourself into the fire, Sellers. Not yet. Not like this." The conflict growing within her flared. She could feel it. The doubt, the anger, the slow-burning horror of recognizing a machine she'd helped build, and only now beginning to see its purpose clearly. "They're going to test her against soldiers," she said. "Imperial soldiers. Our own people." "Yes. And we're supposed to say nothing." Sid was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was hushed, cautious. "We're supposed to survive," he said. "And we're supposed to be very, very careful. Because the day may come when doing something matters. And on that day, we'll need to still be alive to do it." He put his hand on her shoulder, briefly, lightly. Then, he left. Sellers stood alone in the empty room and felt, for the first time, the full weight of the cage she'd been living in. Chapter 3. The Treasure Hunter. The young man arrived on a Tuesday, in the rain. Bannon didn't know what he'd expected. Arvis had mentioned a contact, someone useful, someone with skills the returners desperately needed. And Bannon had imagined, vaguely, a former soldier. Someone broad and scarred and serious, the kind of person who entered a room and made it feel smaller. What came through the door of the meeting hall instead was a lean, sharp-featured young man with a bandana tied around his forehead and a grin that suggested he found the world endlessly, irresistibly amusing. "Bannon," Arvis said, gesturing. "This is Locke Cole. He's a good thief, treasure hunter." Locke inserted immediately, as though correcting a common misconception. He extended his hand. His grip was firm, his palm calloused in odd places, not the calluses of a laborer or a swordsman, but the rough patches that come from climbing, from gripping ledges and ropes, and the edges of things not meant to be gripped. "Arvis tells me you've been busy," Locke said, shaking the rain from his jacket and settling onto a bench as though he'd been coming here for years. There was an ease to him, a looseness in the way he occupied space, that Bannon found both disarming and slightly exhausting. "The Returners. I like the name. It's got weight to it without being heavy, you know? Not the Avengers or the Sword of Justice or something like that. Just people who want to put things back." "That's the idea," Bannon said carefully. "Good idea. Great idea, actually. The Empire's been pushing outward for years, swallowing towns, burning what it can't swallow. Someone's got to push back." He leaned forward. "Arvis said you need information, supply routes, troop movements, contacts in occupied cities. That's what I do. I go places I'm not supposed to be. and I find things people don't want found." "He's being modest," Arvis said dryly. "He's also one of the best scouts on the continent. He's mapped half the Empire's supply network already." "Stumbled across most of it, really," Locke said. But there was a sharpness beneath the casual tone, a flicker of something serious and focused that surfaced and then submerged again, like a fish turning just below the waterline. "I've got contacts in South Figaro, Nicaea, even a few in Vector itself. People who owe me favors, people who hate the Empire, people who just like getting paid. A network's only as good as the people in it, and I've spent a long time finding the right people." Bannon studied him. The young man met his gaze without flinching, without posturing, with the simple directness of someone who had nothing to prove and knew it. There was courage there, not the loud, declarative kind, but the sort that lived in the bones, that expressed itself in action rather than words. Bannon could see it in the way Locke held himself, the way his eyes moved to the door and the window and back again without conscious thought, always aware, always ready. It was exactly the quality Bannon felt most acutely absent in himself. "You're young," Bannon said. "I am," Locke agreed without offense. "This work is dangerous." "I know." Locke's grin faded, and for a moment, Bannon saw something else beneath it. Something older than the young man's years, something weathered and worn. A loss, perhaps. A wound that hadn't fully healed. It passed quickly, but Bannon caught it. "I've got my reasons for doing this. They're my own, and I'll keep them that way if it's all the same to you. But I'm here, and I'm not leaving." Arvis caught Bannon's eye from across the room. The look said, "This is what I was telling you about. This is what we need." Bannon nodded slowly. "We're not an army, Locke. We're a handful of displaced people, with no weapons worth mentioning, and no plan beyond surviving the week. Every river starts with a handful of rain," Locke said. Then he winced. "Sorry, that sounded better in my head." Despite himself, Bannon almost smiled. It was a rare sensation these days, and he held onto it for a moment before letting it pass. They talked long into the evening. Locke spread a hand-drawn map across the table, remarkably detailed, annotated in a quick, slanting hand, and walked Bannon through the Empire's positions, its supply lines, its vulnerabilities. He spoke with the fluency of someone who understood systems, who could look at a sprawling network of roads and garrisons and see not just what was there but what was missing, where the gaps were, where pressure could be applied. Bannon listened, asked questions, and found himself thinking not as a healer, but as something else, something he still didn't have a name for. After Locke had gone to find a dry cot for the night, Arvis lingered. "Well?" Arvis asked. Bannon looked at the map still spread across the table, at the web of lines and annotations that represented, in abstract, the shape of an empire and the fragile beginnings of a resistance. "He's smart," Bannon said quietly. "He's quick, brave, and people trust him. He's everything a leader should be. He's everything a hero should be. Arvis corrected gently. A leader is something different. A leader is someone who sees the remarkable in others and knows what to do with it. That's you, Bannon. That's been you since Miranda. Bannon didn't answer. The following morning, when the rain had cleared and the sun came through the pines in long, bright columns, he found Locke and asked him to stay. Locke said yes without hesitation, as though the question had already been answered long before it was asked. Leo Christoph was the only person in the Imperial Army who made Celes feel, however briefly, that the uniform she wore might still mean something worth believing in. She found him on the training grounds at dusk, standing at the edge of the yard with his arms folded, watching a company of new recruits work through their drills. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with a face that carried its authority quietly, not in sharp angles or hard lines, but in a steadiness of expression that suggested he had long ago made peace with who he was and what he stood for. He didn't posture. He didn't need to. When Leo Christoph entered a room, people straightened, not out of fear, but out of respect, the involuntary response to a presence that was genuinely earned. He glanced at her as she approached and offered a slight nod. "General, General," she returned, and allowed herself the ghost of a smile. It was their new ritual, the formal address that was also, between them, a kind of warmth, a shared pride in her recently acquired position. Leo had risen through the ranks years earlier and had become a role model for Celes. The Empire had given her magic through Sid's infusions, but it had given Leo something perhaps more rare, an unshakable sense of honor that somehow survived everything the Empire asked of him. She admired that. She envied it too, in ways she didn't fully understand. They stood together in silence for a while, watching the recruits. The drills were competent but uninspired. Young men and women going through motions they'd memorized but hadn't yet made their own. Leo watched them with the patient attention of a man who understood that skill was built slowly, in repetition and correction, and couldn't be rushed. "I need to speak with you," Celes said at last. She kept her voice low, conversational, the kind of tone that wouldn't carry beyond the two of them. "About the direction of things." Leo didn't look at her, but his focus shifted. She could feel it, his quiet attention. "Go on." "The campaign in Miranda, the methods being used, the girl, terror." She paused, choosing her words the way one might choose steps on uncertain ground. "I'm not comfortable with what I've seen, Leo. The slave crown, the way she's being used. It's not warfare. It's something else." Leo was quiet for a time. The recruits finished their drill and began again, the sound of wooden practice swords striking shields. "I've had similar thoughts," he said finally. His voice was careful, measured. "There are aspects of our current strategy that I believe merit review. I've said as much to the Emperor. And the Emperor listens, as he always does, and then proceeds as he sees fit." There was no bitterness in it, only the flat acknowledgement of a truth long since accepted. Gestahl has his vision. He doesn't require our approval, only our obedience. Is that enough for you? Leo turned to look at her then, and his expression was complex, a mixture of gravity and something gentler that might have been compassion. I serve the Empire because I believe it can be better than it is. I believe that my presence, our presence, is a moderating force, that without people like us inside the structure, the worst impulses would go entirely unchecked. He paused. Whether that belief is justified or merely convenient, I honestly can't say anymore. It was the most candid thing he'd ever said to her, and Sellers felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she hadn't known she was carrying. What a touching scene. The voice slid into the conversation like a blade between ribs, thin, bright, and precisely aimed. Kefka emerged from the shadow of the colonnade as though he'd been part of it, his painted face catching the last light of the sun in a way that made the colors seem to shift and crawl. He walked toward them with his peculiar, loose-limbed gait, each step slightly off rhythm, slightly wrong, like a marionette whose strings were being pulled by someone who found the concept of natural movement boring. "Two generals conferring at sunset," he said, clasping his hands behind his back. "How very scenic. Are we discussing troop deployments, supply logistics, or something more?" He tilted his head, and his smile widened by a fraction. "Philosophical?" "Kefka," Leo said. His voice had changed, not warmer or colder, but flatter, more formal. The candor of a moment ago was gone, sealed away behind the smooth surface of rank and protocol. "We were reviewing the recruits." "Were you? How diligent." Kefka's gaze drifted to the training yard, where the young soldiers had faltered in their drill, distracted by his arrival. He watched them with the blank, faintly amused expression of someone observing insects. They looked terrified. That's good. Terror is an excellent foundation for discipline. He laughed, a sound like glass breaking in another room. "The Emperor sends his regards, by the way. He wants you both at the strategy session tomorrow morning. Something about the northern campaigns." His eyes slid to Sellers, and he was very pleased with the Miranda report. Very pleased indeed. "You should be proud, General." The words were a compliment in shape only. Beneath them, Sellers could hear the real message. "I know what you are. I know what you think. And I'm watching." "I serve at the Emperor's pleasure," Sellers replied smoothly. "Don't we all?" Kefka murmured. His gaze lingered on her a moment longer before turning away with a theatrical swirl of his robes. "Don't stay out too late, children. The Emperor does so value a well-rested officer." Leo exhaled slowly as Kefka walked away. The formality drained from his posture, leaving behind something heavier, more tired. "Be careful, Sellers," he said quietly. "You sound like Sid." "Then Sid is wise." He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw the same thing. The awareness of walls, of limits, of a space that was shrinking around them both. "There are things I can do for you, and things I cannot. If Kefka decides you're a threat, there are limits to the protection that rank provides, even mine." He placed his hand on her arm, briefly, firmly, and then he walked away toward the barracks, his silhouette straight and steady against the darkening sky. Cells stood alone on the training ground. The recruits had resumed their drill, the wooden swords rising and falling in the fading light. She watched them, young soldiers eager for what the Empire promised, but too naive to understand what it would demand in return. She thought about Terra's empty eyes. She thought about the old healer in Miranda, leading the survivors to safety. The sun set, the yard emptied, and Celes remained, standing in the gathering dark, feeling the walls draw closer and knowing, with absolute certainty, that she could not remain inside those walls much longer. Chapter 4. A New Hope. The letter arrived at dawn, carried by a courier who had ridden through the night. Bannon took the folded paper from the young man's hand, noted the familiar seal, Arvis's mark pressed in plain wax, and broke it open. He read it once, quickly, then again, slowly. Then he sat down. The hideout had grown since Braden's Hollow. They'd moved twice, deeper into the mountains, following paths that Locke had mapped and secured. The current base was a network of natural caves, dry and defensible, connected by passages that the wind moved through with a low, constant murmur. It was not comfortable, but it was safe, and safety had become the currency by which Bannon measured all things. He read the letter a third time. His hands were steady, but something behind his ribs had begun to hum, a vibration he recognized distantly as hope. A girl has appeared in Nash. Green hair, wielding magic, real magic. She arrived with 2 Imperial soldiers in Magitech armor, apparently on a mission to investigate the Esper frozen in the mines. Something went wrong. The soldiers are dead or fled. The girl survived, but she has no memory, save one thing: her name, Terra. Bannon closed his eyes. Behind them, as vivid as the day it had happened, he saw the burning streets of Miranda. He saw the green hair. He saw the crown with its pulsing crystal, the empty face beneath it. And he saw the wave of destruction. He had never forgotten that image. It had lived in him for months, not as a nightmare, but as a question, a possibility, if that power could be turned against the Empire. He opened his eyes. He needed Locke. He found him in the eastern passage, sitting on a flat stone near the mouth of the cave. Locke was cleaning a knife, a small practical blade, well maintained. He looked up as Bannon approached. "You've got that look," Locke noticed. "The one that means something's happened." Bannon sat down across from him. Outside, the mountains rose in layered blues and greys, and the sky was the pale, washed color of early autumn. "I have a mission," Bannon began. "But before I tell you what it is, I need to ask you something." Locke set the knife down. His expression shifted, not to wariness, but to a quiet, focused attention. If something happens to me, Bannon continued, I want you to lead the returners. The silence that followed was long enough for the wind to pass through the cave mouth and out again. Locke stared at him. I've thought about this carefully. You have the skills, the contacts, the instincts. People follow you, not because you ask them to, but because you make them believe that the next step is worth taking. That's rarer than you know. He paused. I'm an old man with a talent for mending cuts. The returners need someone who can do more than that. Locke looked away, toward the mountains. Something moved across his face. That old, weathered thing that Bannon had glimpsed the first day they'd met. The wound that lived beneath the grin. I'm not who you think I am, he said quietly. Tell me. For a moment, Bannon thought he wouldn't. Locke's jaw tightened, and his hand moved unconsciously to his chest, as though pressing against something hidden there, a memory perhaps, or a weight he carried close to his heart. There was a woman, he breathed. Her name was Rachel. He spoke slowly, haltingly, in the way of someone unfolding a thing that had been kept tightly bound for a long time. He told Bannon about Rachel, about loving her, about failing her, about the injuries she sustained trying to save him. The details were spare and offered reluctantly, but the shape of the story was clear. A loss that had defined him. A guilt that had burrowed into the foundation of who he is. That's why I do this, Locke said. The rescues, the missions, the running toward danger instead of away from it. It's not heroism, Bannon. It's penance. I keep trying to save people because I couldn't save her. The wind moved through the passage. Bannon listened to it, and to the silence that followed Locke's words, letting both settle before he spoke. I understand, he said gently, and I'm not asking you to be free of that. I'm asking you to carry it forward into something that matters. He reached into his coat and drew out Arvis's letter. A girl has appeared in Nash. She has green hair, wields magic, and she has no memory. She was the Empire's weapon. I've seen her power with my own eyes, Locke. In Miranda. It was the most terrible and extraordinary thing I've ever witnessed. If she's free of the Empire's control, if she can be reached, she could change everything. He held out the letter. Locke took it, read it. His eyes widened. Her name, Bannon said quietly, is Terra, and she needs someone to save her. Locke looked up from the letter. The old wound was still there, visible in the lines around his eyes, but something else had kindled alongside it, something fierce and determined. I'll go to Nash, he said firmly. Afterwards, we can talk about the future of the returners. Fair enough. Locke folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside his jacket. I'm not a leader. Neither was I, Bannon replied. Locke nodded. He crossed the cave in 3 quick strides, paused at the mouth to look back once, and then he was gone. Out into the bright, cold morning, moving fast and sure along the mountain path, headed north. Bannon sat for a while longer in the quiet. The dust motes turned in the light. The wind murmured through the stone. And for the first time in a long time, the old healer allowed himself to believe that the world might still be capable of turning towards something better. They came for her in the night. Not soldiers, Kefka. He arrived at her quarters with 4 guards and a smile that split his painted face like a wound. Celes knew before he spoke a single word that the cage had finally closed. "General Chair," he said, and the title dripped from his lips like something spoiled. "You've been very busy." The charges were precise, elaborate, and almost entirely fabricated. Kefka laid them out with the relish of a performer delivering a monologue he'd rehearsed many times. Terra had been sent to Narshe on a routine mission, crown intact, obedient as ever. But something had gone wrong. The crown had failed. Terra had broken free. The soldiers accompanying her were dead, and the mission was in ruins. And the crown, Kefka explained, leaning close enough that Celes could see the cracked edges of his face paint, had been tampered with, replaced, in fact. A forgery, clever, convincing, but ultimately flawed. The real crown's crystal had a specific resonance, and the one recovered from Narshe did not match. Someone had swapped it before the mission. Someone with access to the girl. Someone who had been seen not so long ago, showing keen interest in Terra's crown. "You," Kefka intoned with satisfaction. "That's a lie," Celes said. "Is it? The evidence says otherwise, and evidence is such a stubborn thing." The hearing was brief. Gestal presided from his throne with the distant patience of a man who had already made his decision and was merely observing the formalities. Sid spoke in Celes's defense, carefully, precisely, laying out the technical impossibility of the forgery Kefka described, the lack of opportunity, the absence of motive. Leo stood beside him and added his voice, steady and measured, testifying to Celes's loyalty, her service record, her character. It didn't matter. The evidence, documents, testimony from guards whose accounts were suspiciously uniform, was overwhelming in volume, if not in truth. Gestal listened to Sid and Leo with the same placid attention he would give to a chocobo, before delivering his verdict in a voice that carried no emotion at all. Imprisonment, pending execution. Sid's face went grey. Leo's hand curled into a fist at his side. They both looked at Celes as the guards took her arms, and in their eyes she saw the same helpless recognition. They knew she was innocent. They all knew. And it changed. Nothing. She was taken to South Figaro and put in a secret cell beneath the mayor's mansion. It was cold, damp, and the only light came from a single torch in the passage outside the bars. The guards locked the door and left, and for a few minutes there was silence. Then the footsteps returned. Light, uneven, theatrical. Kefka appeared beyond the bars, a silhouette framed in torchlight. He stood there for a moment, savouring the image before leaning against the iron with a contented sigh. "Ah, you know," he said in the tone of someone making pleasant conversation. I've waited a long time for this. It's been very tedious watching you walk around with that serious expression, playing at being the Empire's golden general. So righteous, so principled, so... He waved a hand vaguely. Tiresome. You planted the evidence, Sellers spat. Every piece of it. Did I? How industrious of me. He examined his fingernails with studied disinterest. You know what always bothered me about you, Sellers. It wasn't the morality, though. That was certainly irritating. It was the... He stopped. His mouth twitched, and something flickered behind his eyes. Something hot, sharp, and perhaps envious. For a moment, the mask slipped, and Sellers saw what lay beneath. The raw, consuming jealousy of a man who could not bear to share the stage. He caught himself. The mask slid back into place, smiling like a jester. Your little magic infusion, he continued, his tone breezy again. Sid's great achievement, ice and frost, and all those quaint little parlor tricks. Very impressive, for what they are. He leaned closer to the bars. But my infusion gave me something far more valuable. Clarity, the ability to see things as they truly are, without all the clutter of sentiment and doubt and conscience. You look at the world and see suffering. I look at the world and see... He paused, and his smile widened into something vast and empty. Possibility. He straightened, brushed an invisible speck from his sleeve, turned to go. No one is coming for you, Sellers, he said over his shoulder, the words soft and final. Leo can't help you. Sid can't help you. The Emperor has spoken. You're going to stay in this cell, and when the time comes, you're going to die. And nobody can stop that from happening now. His footsteps faded down the corridor. The torch guttered, and she was alone. Sellers sat on the cold stone bench, leaned her back against the wall, and closed her eyes. She thought about the ashes of Miranda, about Sid's gentle warning, and Leo's steady hand on her arm. Her mind shifted to terror, now free from the slave crown, and the thought made her smile. She wondered what she would do with that freedom. Sellers didn't sleep. The hours passed like cold water, slow and heavy. The torch outside burned low, and the darkness in the cell became absolute. Finally, succumbing to gravity's insistent pull, Sellers closed her eyes. When she woke, she didn't know what day it was. Time had become unreliable. The cell had no window. She'd slept in fragments, brief collapses into unconsciousness that left her more exhausted than before. And so, from her position, shackled to the wall, Sellers listened to the silence and tried not to think about what was coming. Then, a sound, a rustle, faint, deliberate, coming from the passage beyond her cell. The sound of bodies hitting the floor. Sellers opened her eyes. A figure stepped into the torchlight. He was young, lean, sharp-featured, with a bandana tied around his forehead, and an expression that was both intensely serious and surprisingly warm. He moved to the bars of her cell and looked in at her. "My name is Locke," he said. "Don't worry. I'm going to rescue you." She looked up at the stranger. There was something there. The certainty in his voice, the determination in his eyes. And Celes felt something ignite within her chest. Something that felt like